So we decided to do the economics of climate change, which is this word that Deepak came up with, the climanomics. And so the reason why we feel like this is so important is because we just had this amazing speech on why it's such a good idea to be a vegan. But if we're being completely honest, my dad does not care. And a lot of the people in his generation just don't care. And then even the health effects that we also had a presentation on are also really important, that it actually does affect them. It hasn't gotten to a point that's bad enough that they have to admit that it's because of climate change. So they can still say like, oh, it's because of this other thing, and then they still just don't care. But something that everyone really cares about, especially even in our current government, is economics, and so we have to hit them where it hurts, and that's why we decided to do climanomics. And so we decided to start broad with the entirety of the US, and then we're going to go into some more specifics that only affect California. And so we decided to start off with the cost of inaction, because the first thing that people want to do is to do nothing. And so basically this is kind of a threat on why you shouldn't do nothing, because it'll actually be more expensive. So first of all, the rising sea level. The Gulf of Mexico, there's supposed to be $3.5 billion of damage, and the coastal property submerged is going to be $66 billion to $106 billion worth. And I think it could also even be up to $200 billion in worst case scenario. And then in agriculture, which is very important, especially to us in California, the wheat and corn yields are supposed to decrease by 10% in the next 25 years. And that's a low ball. It could actually end up being up to 20% if we really don't do anything. And the 2.2 decrease in labor productivity is specifically because of the health effects, because when you're in the field, you're in the heat, and there's not really much you can do about that. So that kind of brings me into the temperature rise. That because there's going to be so many places that are now over 95 degrees all summer long, that affects people in houses. You're going to have to put in air conditionings, which is going to cost money. And if you don't do that, then there's going to be health effects. And so all of this just leads to costing a lot of money. And so we went to this website that Mrs. Buck had us go to called Risky Business. And it's a collaboration of billionaires that understand why the economics of why climate change is so important. And so this 80% of carbon reduction is the important level that we need to reach. And so there's 4 different ways that we can do that. And so the first 3 are rely heavily on renewable energy, which is kind of the golden standard that we would like to have, but that's kind of difficult to get to. And so the next idea is to significantly expand reliance on nuclear power, which I know some people are a little bit upset about, and I don't think it's actually bad if you do it correctly, and we have a lot of standards in America that we can do it correctly. And then the last kind of like resort is to capture and store our carbon when we are using our coal. And then the fourth one, which is what we will most likely do, is a mixed resource pathway that starts with all 3 and then hopefully ends up focusing on the renewable energies. And so this over here is the amount of money that you will have to invest and how much you will save. So in 2020 to 2030, we have to invest $220 billion per year, and that sounds like a lot, but you'll save $70 billion per year, and this is investments in the renewable energies and things like that. And then in 2030, you will have to invest up to $410 billion per year, but our savings will increase up to $370 billion per year. And then in 2040 to 50 is when we finally start seeing a net savings, when we're only investing $360 billion per year, but we're saving $700 billion per year, and that will increase. And so our savings will start to outweigh our costs.
So to cut carbon emissions down 80%, our total investment from 2020 to 2050 would be $9.9 trillion. However, these costs don't go to vain. They reduce fuel costs, giving an estimated savings of from 2020 to 2050 of $11.4 million. So by cutting down our carbon emissions by 80%, we save $1.5 trillion by 2050. And the positive impact financially and environmentally substantially outweigh the risks of not undertaking this project. So here's a quote. We can reduce climate risks with existing clean technologies. We don't need an energy miracle. Henry M. Paulson Jr. So this basically is telling that we're already advanced enough to have like all of this clean energy. It's basically all on policy that we need. So talking about policy, so the clean energy transition can happen only if the private sector invests in clean energy and efficiency, deploys low carbon technologies, and continues to innovate. But the private sector in turn will take these actions at a necessary speed and scale only if they can do so on a back on a clear and consistent policy and regulatory framework that provides incentives for innovation and deployment of clean energy and systems. A strong policy foundation sets the stage for strategic climate change decisions by executives and boards. It is the core responsibility of the government to take the long view and to provide the support for infrastructure, innovation, and investments that will underpin the clean energy economy across every region and sector in this country.
So now moving a little more specific into California. So we in California, we assume that California is doing a lot of things to combat climate change, and I'm pretty sure people outside of California think that as well. But a lot of the effects in California, a lot of the climate risks will also affect our economy. So currently, California is the most populous state of the U.S., and it's essentially the 8th and will soon be the 7th largest economy in the world. So it's essentially like a mini nation in its own in terms of economics. But a lot of the risks caused by climate change will heavily impact its the economy related to those sectors. So the Risky Business website also broke down these risks into climates and the economic risks caused by those climate risks. For example, with agriculture, with the increase in climate change and with those changes, there will be a change in agricultural patterns, which will cause a threat to California's crops. Since California is currently supplies 1/5 of the U.S.'s dairy and 2/3 of of the fruit of the U.S. A lot of the impacts on the agriculture, such as the increase of heat and the decrease of sort of heat-resistant crops, will impact the fruit and dairy production, which will decrease the agricultural business. Moving on to sea levels, as Meg previously covered, with the U.S.'s billions of dollars of lost in coastal property, California will face sort of a similar problem on a micro scale version, where we will lose about $8 to $10 billion of property worth by 2050, and another $8 to $10 billion of coastal property by 2100. Furthermore, California is known for its tourism, whether it be Hollywood coming to SF, touring LA, etc. But with an increase in temperature and an increase in heat, this will impact the tourism industry simply because it's hard for tourists to tour cities when there are sort of heat waves and sort of warnings related to heat. That will overall impact the tourism industry and reduce all of its events and tours across cities. Furthermore, precipitation. California's current precipitation, a lot of it also comes from the snowbanks up in the Sierra Nevadas. But with the increased heat, this will change a lot of the snow to rain, which will actually decrease a lot of its precipitation and keep a lot more in the air. Due to that, a lot of the industries that depend on fresh water and bottling fresh water, such as companies such as, Arrowhead and Kirkland, those companies will face a loss due to the loss of fresh water that they can use. Electricity. We all use electricity in our homes and for air conditioning, for our cars, etc. And with the increase in heat, there will be an increase in energy demand, because many of the families in California will use it for air conditioning. But with the heat, we'll also have weakened supplies, and with increased energy demand and weakened supplies, it's a quick conclusion that we'll just have increased energy costs, which will put more pressure on every family in California. And finally, the human cost will reduce labor production. When there are many workers working out in farms and in the fields, increased heat means there's a higher chance of stroke and a higher chance of heat-related sort of injuries, which will reduce the overall labor productivity of all of us. Yeah. This is a comparison of currently California's current average days over 95 degrees. We can see that right now, although it's hard to see, I guess, There are areas that have a lot of days over 95 degrees, but as we go throughout the rest of the century, by the time we get to the year 2100, especially down inland south, we're going to have larger areas that have many more days, many more average number of days over 95 degrees. And this isn't just the summer. This is going to be during late spring and early fall as well, which means we'll see an increase in just general days and general temperatures. And finally, the spectrum of climate events provided by Risky Business shows that generally we have sort of a spectrum of events from sort of like the normal, which is in the middle of climate events, whether it be like sort of just hot days to cool days, the normal things that you would expect. And then there are the two outliers, which are like more unnatural. For example, if you have like cold summer days, which would be on the left side, versus like warm winter and fall days, which would be on the right side. Those show the more extreme versions of climate change. But as we move throughout the century, the whole spectrum will shift to where our outliers will soon become like the new normals, and the normals we used to have will just be like sort of less impacted, and the outliers will just get more extreme, which shows that the spectrum will just continue shifting, and all of our events will just get more extreme.
Okay, so next I decided to take a look at the Risky Business Billionaires project and what their plan is for the future. And basically they said that as we are already capable of managing other areas of the economy and national security, if we put the same amount of effort in now as opposed to later, we would be able to mitigate the effects of climate change. But I'm going to jump over to this graph here. This is 2100 and this is where we are right now. And the other side is atmospheric CO2. The red line is business as usual, and it says that if we continue in a business as usual scenario, the devastating effects of climate change are inevitable, and we've already gone over the rising sea levels, more heat, drought, etc. This isn't necessarily for California, but incorporating climate risks into capital expenditures, basically what this means is businesses have long-term expenditure plans that don't necessarily comply with long-term climate change. Just a statistic, 2013, 40% of companies listed in Standard & Poor's 500 index, which is a stock market index, were not voluntarily disclosing climate risk incorporation, which is something that would need to happen if these businesses want to have success in the future, but they're not really taking it into account now when action needs to be taken. So finally, we have the effects on jobs in the energy sector. This isn't necessarily about climate change and climate change, but it's more when we begin to switch over to renewable resources like we already have. There are going to be added financial pressures to workers, since coal miners, for example, wouldn't have their jobs anymore. A big part of that would be that to retrain them to work in wind power and hydroelectricity. And the Department of Energy has mapped out over 40 types of solar jobs, which these coal-based workers might be able to transition into. This graph over here, it's years, and then this is where we are right now. And then on the other side, it's the amount of jobs in the coal industry. And you can see that we've gone down recently, and very more recently we've gone a little bit up. And this bar graph is this is the coal industry, this is the solar industry, and this is just the amount of jobs in general. We found some statistics on the Risky Business website, and it said that within the decades of coal declining, there would be 2 times more solar jobs. But it's not all negative, because there is a projected 7% salary increase from switching to coal to renewable. And then finally, this kind of reminds me of the documentary we watched last week. There would be apprenticeship programs for learning about how to transition into renewable energy.
So to kind of just wrap it all up, there are some negative effects by switching over. As we said, we're going to have to retrain a lot of people, but they can actually end up getting more money. They just have to go through that short-term hardship. And we just think that in the long term, if we don't do anything now, it's actually just going to be so much worse, just purely financially, if that's the only thing people think about. Thank you.
Nice.